the mother who's a flamboyant California biker with an affinity for who bravely raises her little son Rocky, a little boy with a rare disease that eventually distorts his face into a cruel mask of deformity.
You've seen the movie. You've watched Cher in leather, riding a motorcycle, screaming at doctors who wouldn't take her son seriously. You've cried at the ending, the way most audiences did back in 1985. Mask turned Rocky Dennis into one of Hollywood's most beloved symbols of courage in the face of a cruel disease. But here's the part almost nobody talks about. The real woman behind that character, Florence Rusty Dennis, spent years quietly correcting the record, and some of what she said in her final interviews doesn't match the warm, tidy version audiences fell in love with. She talked about money. She talked about a son the movie erased completely. And she talked about the choices she made as a mother that she never once apologized for, even when those choices are uncomfortable to hear now. This is the real story of Rocky Dennis, his mother Rusty, and the things she said before she was gone that reframe everything you thought you knew. Before the film, before the awards buzz, before Cher ever read the script, there was just a boy in Southern California trying to grow up like anyone else. Roy Lee Dennis was born in the early 1960s to Florence Dennis, a young mother who would later become known to everyone simply as Rusty. As an infant, he wouldn't settle unless he was rocked, and the nickname stuck for life. In his first couple of years, doctors noticed nothing unusual beyond ordinary childhood illnesses, occasional ear infections, the kind of thing every toddler goes through. Then, during a routine procedure to address recurring throat infections, something on an X-ray caught a technician's eye. The shape of his skull wasn't right. What came next was a grueling stretch of appointments, referrals, and specialists, as doctors tried to understand what they were looking at. Eventually, a diagnosis arrived that would define the rest of Rocky's life, a rare bone disorder that caused calcium to build up abnormally within the skull. As the deposits grew, they pressed outward on the face and inward on the brain, gradually distorting his features while threatening his sight, his hearing, and his neurological function. It was, and still is, an extraordinarily rare condition. At the time, doctors believed only a small handful of cases had ever been documented anywhere in medical history. The prognosis they gave Rusty was blunt and devastating. Her son would likely lose his vision, might never develop normally, and probably would not survive past early childhood. Most parents hearing a prognosis like that would brace for the worst and grieve in advance. Rusty didn't. Depending on which interview you read, she either laughed in the doctor's face or simply refused to accept the timeline as fact. What mattered more than the exact words was the pattern that followed for the rest of Rocky's life. Whenever an institution tried to tell her what her son couldn't do, she pushed back, loudly and repeatedly. That pattern showed up everywhere. When schools suggested Rocky's poor eyesight meant he shouldn't be expected to read at grade level, she disagreed and insisted he keep up with his peers. When administrators tried to shuffle him out of regular classrooms and into separate programs, she resisted, arguing that the discomfort belonged to the other parents and the other kids, not to her son. In interviews years later, she said plainly that she never believed Rocky's intelligence was the issue. It was everyone else's ability to look past his face that was the real obstacle. And by most accounts, that stubbornness paid off. Teachers and camp counselors who worked with Rocky described a kid who was funny, sharp, and remarkably comfortable in his own skin. Someone who made other people forget what he looked like within minutes of a conversation. A screenwriter who later spent time researching his life for what would become Mask came away from meeting him convinced that whatever Rusty was doing as a parent, unconventional as it looked from the outside, was exactly what her son needed. But to really understand what Rusty said later in life, and why some of it landed so uncomfortably, you have to understand who she was long before she became anyone's movie subject. Cher's performance in Mask is often remembered as fierce and glamorous, a tough-as-nails biker mom with a heart of gold. That's not inaccurate exactly, but it's incomplete. It's the polished, three-act version of a much messier, much more chaotic real person. Florence Dennis grew up in New York in a working-class family, the kind of upbringing where nobody had time to hover. By her own account, she was already a handful as a young teenager, in trouble at school for skipping classes, drawn to older crowds, and drifting toward the kind of independence most parents would find alarming. She left formal schooling behind before finishing, took odd jobs to support herself, and by her mid-teens was already moving in circles that most sheltered kids her age never encountered, including early exposure to motorcycle culture that would define much of the rest of her life. Her first marriage came young, and with it, her first son. That relationship didn't last, and Rusty found herself starting over more than once before eventually settling in California, remarrying, and welcoming Rocky into the world. By the time his diagnosis arrived, she had already lived through enough upheaval that a devastating medical prognosis, as brutal as it was, didn't break her the way it might have broken someone with a more conventional, sheltered life. One belief shaped almost everything about how she raised her son, the idea that the mind has real power over the body, that a person who could talk themselves into feeling sick could, in theory, talk themselves back into feeling well. She leaned on that philosophy constantly. When Rocky's headaches flared, which they did often and with increasing severity as he got older, her instinct wasn't always to rush him to a hospital. Often, it was to send him to his room and tell him to work through it, to push past it, to make himself well again the way he always had. For most of his life, that approach seemed to work, at least well enough that he kept defying his prognosis year after year. Whether that philosophy was empowering, reckless, or some complicated mixture of both is something reasonable people can disagree about. It's not our place to hand down a verdict on a mother's private choices raising a terminally diagnosed child decades ago. What we can say is that Rusty never treated it as a mistake. She talked about it, when asked, with total conviction, not defensiveness. The film also touched on something that was very real and rarely softened in Rusty's own retelling: her connection to a motorcycle club. This wasn't a costume or a Hollywood flourish. It was her actual community. The people who showed up, who treated Rocky like one of their own, who built a rough-edged but genuinely loving support system around a boy the rest of the world often stared at or looked away from. The character based on her longtime partner in the film reflects a real relationship, and by every account, the extended biker family around Rocky adored him without reservation. As for the drug use that the film gestures toward, Rusty was refreshingly blunt about it in interviews later in life. She didn't frame it as a symptom of despair or a coping mechanism for raising a dying child, the way audiences might have assumed watching the movie. She described it more simply, as part of a lifestyle she was already living, something she did because that was the culture she belonged to, not because she was drowning in grief. That distinction mattered to her. She wanted people to understand she wasn't a tragic figure self-medicating her way through motherhood. She was who she was, and the drugs were part of that identity long before Rocky's diagnosis ever entered the picture. So when Hollywood came calling to turn her son's short, extraordinary life into a feature film, what exactly did a woman like this have to say about it? By the mid-1980s, Mask had become one of the more talked-about dramas of the year. Cher's performance drew serious award consideration, and the film did solid business at the box office, pulling in tens of millions of dollars against a modest production budget. Rusty, for the rights to her own life story and her son's, was paid a fraction of that, a sum in the low five figures. It's the kind of number that, when you say it next to the film's total earnings, sounds almost insulting. But the fuller picture is more complicated and more painful than a simple story about Hollywood shortchanging a grieving mother. According to Rusty's own later accounts, much of the money she did receive went toward medical bills, not for Rocky, but for her older son, who by that point was seriously ill. She wasn't cashing in on her dead son's memory for personal gain. She was using what little the studio offered to try to keep her surviving child alive a little longer. When reporters came around expecting a grateful, tearful mother thanking Hollywood for honoring her son's memory, they often got something far more unfiltered instead. Rusty had a habit of describing the film, point blank, as a kind of fairy tale, not a documentary, not the unvarnished truth, but a version of events shaped and softened for a mass audience. She wasn't hostile about it. In fact, she frequently praised Cher's performance, saying the actress had captured her personality with startling accuracy. What seemed to genuinely surprise her was how much of the film's emotional weight shifted onto her character, rather than staying focused on Rocky. She had always seen the story as her son's story. The finished film, in her eyes, turned it into as much her story as his. She was also candid about how much the timeline had been compressed. Real events that unfolded over more than a decade were condensed into what looks, on screen, like roughly a year. That's an understandable filmmaking choice, but it flattens the reality of how long Rocky actually lived with his condition. How many years of doctor's appointments, school fights, and daily headaches got folded into a tight 2-hour runtime. Then there was the music. Rocky had been a genuine, devoted fan of one specific rock artist during his life, and the director had built much of the film's intended soundtrack around that artist's songs. But rights negotiations with the record label fell apart late in production, and the studio swapped in a different artist's music, without fully looping the director in. Rusty didn't hide her frustration about this. She pointed out, in more than one interview, that the replacement soundtrack barely reflected her son's actual taste in music, going so far as to suggest Rocky probably wouldn't have recognized half the songs used to represent his own life on screen. It's a small detail in the grand scheme of the film's story, but it stuck with her, maybe because it symbolized something bigger. How many small, true things about her son got smoothed over or swapped out in the process of turning his life into entertainment? All of that, though, the money, the compressed timeline, the soundtrack swap, is really just the warm-up. The part of Rusty's later interviews that tends to land the hardest isn't about the movie business at all. It's about the night her son actually died. By the time Rocky reached his mid-teens, the disease that doctors had once predicted would kill him before he turned 7 had finally begun to catch up with him in earnest. He was spending more time in a wheelchair. The headaches that had shadowed him his entire life were becoming harder to push through, no matter how much willpower he brought to bear. On what would turn out to be his final evening, the family went out together, a small, ordinary outing that in hindsight reads as almost unbearably poignant. By most accounts, it was clear to everyone around him that night just how much his body had deteriorated. When they got home, Rocky complained of a headache, the same kind of complaint he'd voiced thousands of times before over the years. And Rusty responded the way she always had, telling him to go rest, to lie down, to work through it and make himself well again, just like every other time. He didn't wake up the next morning. Rocky died peacefully in his sleep at home, just shy of his 17th birthday, having outlived a doctor's death sentence by nearly a decade. Here's where the film and reality genuinely diverge in a way worth sitting with. On screen, audiences watch Rusty discover her son's body herself, a gut-wrenching scene that anchors the film's emotional climax. In real life, Rusty wasn't home when Rocky died. She was dealing with a legal matter tied to a drug charge, away from house, and it was her longtime partner who found Rocky and had to call her with the news. That gap between the cinematic version and what actually happened doesn't make Rusty a villain, but it does underline just how much smoothing and softening went into turning a genuinely messy, complicated life into a 2-hour dramatic arc with a clean emotional through line. There's also the uncomfortable question hovering underneath all of this. Did sending Rocky to his room that final night, the same way she always had, in any way delay getting him help sooner? It's a question Rusty was never quoted publicly agonizing over, and it would be dishonest to invent guilt or regret she never actually expressed. What the record shows is that she stood by her parenting approach completely, right up until the end. She never described it as a mistake in any interview on record. She believed, without apparent doubt, that raising Rocky to fight through pain rather than surrender to it was exactly what had given him nearly 10 extra years that doctors said he shouldn't have had at all. Whether you find that conviction admirable or unsettling probably depends on your own instincts about parenting a terminally diagnosed child. It's genuinely both at once, and Rusty herself never tried to resolve that tension for the cameras. She just kept living according to it. To understand why she made the choices she made, though, especially the choice to sell her son's story to Hollywood in the first place, you have to know about the son the movie left out entirely. Rocky wasn't Rusty's only child. Years before he was born, she had a son from her first marriage, a boy who grew into a writer living in San Francisco by the time Mask hit theaters. He doesn't appear anywhere in the film, not as a background character, not as a passing mention, nothing. For a movie built entirely around one family story, the complete erasure of an entire sibling is a striking choice, and it's one that reportedly bothered Rusty more than almost anything else about how the film handled her life. Not long after the movie's release, That older son was diagnosed with a cancer closely associated with the AIDS crisis that was devastating communities across the country at the time. He was open about being gay, and by Rusty's own account, she supported him fully, even as she quietly hoped, in the way many mothers do, for grandchildren someday. He died a few years later, still in his early 30s. Think about what that means. Within roughly a decade, Rusty lost both of her sons to two entirely different, entirely merciless illnesses, and the money she'd been paid for the rights to tell one son's story had gone, in large part, toward trying to keep the other one alive a little longer. She wasn't cashing in on tragedy for profit. She was doing what desperate parents do, using whatever resources she had access to in order to buy her surviving child more time. In one of her later interviews, she was quoted describing her outlook simply. Neither she nor her older son believed in dying, not as a concept they were willing to accept quietly. Whether that reflects genuine spiritual conviction, sheer stubbornness, or just a coping mechanism forged by losing everyone she loved too early, it's impossible to say from the outside, but it's consistent with everything else we know about her. Rusty Dennis did not do grief the way people expected her to. So when it finally came time for her own story to end, what did she leave behind? After Rocky died, Rusty didn't retreat from the world. She relocated to San Francisco, took an interest in Buddhist practice, and began working as a counselor helping people struggling with addiction, work that must have carried a strange, personal resonance given her own history. Around the time the film was released, she had plans to volunteer with an organization supporting terminally ill patients, including people living with AIDS, the same disease that had taken her older son. The chaotic, headline-grabbing biker mom of the tabloids was, by then, quietly building a life around service to people facing the same kinds of battles her own family had fought. She never stopped riding motorcycles. In the mid-2000s, decades after Rocky's death, she was riding a three-wheeled motorcycle when a tire failure sent the bike out of control. She struck a curb and was thrown into a telephone pole, suffering serious injuries, including broken bones and a punctured lung. In a detail that's almost hard to believe, friends and family reportedly didn't even know about the accident right away. It was only after a small local news item mentioned an unidentified older woman injured in a motorcycle crash that people close to her put the pieces together and rushed to find her. She survived that initial impact. Of course she did. Survival had been her defining trait for her entire life, but an infection that developed afterward proved to be more than her body could overcome, and she passed away at a hospital in Southern California in her early 70s. Even in her final years, by every account, she never softened into the kind of tidy, redemptive figure audiences might have wanted. She described Rocky's death not as a tragedy she never recovered from, but as him simply moving on to somewhere else, framing it in language that reflected how much she loved travel and motion and refused to see endings as final. She talked about death generally, as something she and her surviving son simply didn't buy into as a concept worth fearing. She never publicly asked why any of this had happened to her family. Not about Rocky, not about her older son, not about herself. One newspaper profile from the years after Mask's release painted an unforgettable picture of her life at the time. A Jewish mother from a rough New York upbringing, a former dancer, a recovering addict turned health products distributor, living in a surprisingly tidy apartment in San Francisco's Mission District alongside a nephew and a rotating cast of biker friends with nicknames straight out of a movie. It's a description that sounds almost too colorful to be real, but by every account, it was accurate, and it captures something essential about who she was. A genuinely contradictory person who somehow made all those contradictions work. Strip away the Hollywood polish, and here's what the historical record actually shows. Rocky Dennis lived nearly 17 years with a disease doctors originally believed would kill him before he ever started school. In that time, he became an honor student despite starting well behind his classmates. He earned nicknames and awards from friends and camp counselors that had nothing to do with his appearance and everything to do with his character. Most good-natured, friendliest, the kind of kid other kids genuinely wanted to be around. He tutored classmates for pocket money and negotiated his own rate. He fell for a girl at summer camp who happened to be blind, someone who related to him without ever needing to look past his face, because she couldn't see it in the first place. When doctors eventually offered him surgery that might have changed his appearance, he reportedly turned it down, asking who exactly he'd be looking at in the mirror afterward if he let them change his face. He chose to keep the face he had. His mother was, by any conventional measure, an unlikely candidate for Mother of the Year. A high school dropout with a history of drug use and a defiant streak that never really faded. She nonetheless spent years fighting schools, doctors, and institutions that tried to define her son by his diagnosis instead of his character. She surrounded him with a rough-edged but fiercely loyal community that treated him like family, not a curiosity. She told him constantly that his condition didn't make him a victim. And yes, on the very last night of his life, she told him what she'd told him 1,000 times before, to go rest and fight through the pain on his own. That instruction had worked, in some sense, for 16 years. It just happened to be the instruction he was following when he finally didn't wake up. The screenwriter who eventually turned their story into a film once summed Rusty up about as well as anyone has. She wasn't the kind of mother PTA meetings are built around, but she was exactly the mother her son needed. Whether you read that as praise, criticism, or something more complicated than either, the underlying facts don't change. Rocky Dennis died at home, in his sleep, without hospital machinery, without a drawn-out medical ordeal, surrounded by the same kind of unconventional love that had defined his entire short life. That was something his mother had effectively promised him, in her own way, for years. And in the end, she kept that promise. Rusty Dennis died in November of 2006, in her early 70s, the same way she'd lived her entire life, in motion, unwilling to slow down, and completely on her own terms. If you were hoping for a tidy conclusion here, a redemption arc, a moment where everything resolves into something comfortable and clean, that's simply not what the story offers. What it offers instead is something harder to package, but far more honest. Two people, a mother and a son, who lived through a version of hardship most of us will never fully understand, who refused again and again to be defined by what other people expected of them, and who left behind a story far messier, far more human, and ultimately far more compelling than the version Hollywood put on screen. It's worth pausing on just how rare a story like this really is. Most biographical dramas get made, get their award season run, and then quietly fade into cable reruns, while the real people behind them are never heard from again. Rusty Dennis was different. She kept talking. She gave interviews for years after the film came and went, and she never once tried to shape her answers into something more palatable for an audience. She didn't perform grief for reporters. She didn't perform gratitude for the studio. She just told the truth as she understood it, again and again, even when that truth complicated the tidy, inspirational narrative millions of moviegoers had already fallen in love with. That kind of consistency, refusing to soften a story just because the softened version sells better, is rare enough on its own to deserve attention. Now you know the fuller picture. Drop a comment and let us know if any of this surprised you, because most people only know the movie version. And if stories like this are the kind of thing you want more of, stick around, because we've got plenty more true stories behind Hollywood's most famous, inspired by real events films coming soon.